This is from Vsevolod Setchkarev's Gogol, His Life and Works, and this is just the section on his theater pieces. Gogol's theater pieces. In the summer of 1835, Gogol was engaged in the composition of a tragedy drawn from English history, which remained a fragment. According to a later assertion of Gogol's, it was to be called Alfred. It deals with the famous English king, 849 to 901, who fought against the Danish invaders and who was a noted ruler, lawgiver, scholar, and writer. The first act and the beginning of the second have been preserved, presumably with certain gaps. At the university, Gogol lectured on the history of the English Middle Ages, among other things, and in addition carried on extensive research in this area, so that the choice of the theme is not at all hard to understand. His sources, as far as we have been able to ascertain, were above all Henry Hallam's book, View of the State of Europe During the Middle Ages, in French translation, Paris, 1821. Paul de Rapinthoira's Histoire de l'Angleterre depuis l'Establishment des Romans dans la Grande-Bretagne jusqu'à la mort de Charles I, The Hague, 1721 to 1736, and Augustin Thierry's Histoire de la Conquête de l'Angleterre par les Normands, Paris, 1830. Pardon my French. This list is further proof that Gogol was well versed in the field and that he was well acquainted with the literature. The dramatization was undoubtedly worked out on the model of Shakespeare and of Pushkin's Boris Godunov. On the basis of the fragment, we can come to no conclusion about the further development of the tragedy. It probably was intended as a patriotic apotheosis of monarchy. Presumably, Gogol was again unable to invent a tightly worked out plot. The scenes were not printed during his lifetime, and the first edition appeared in 1856. The subject of the fragment is the Anglo-Saxon struggle against the Danes. The first scenes characterize the Anglo-Saxon people, who are gathered on the coast excitedly awaiting the arrival of the new king. The following scenes portray the king himself in combat with the Danes, showing both his positive and negative sides. We perceive that the mainspring of the action was to be the inability of his rough, superstitious, egotistical vassals to understand his enlightened endeavors. The disunity and desire for revenge rife among the vassals are presumably the other motifs with which he intended to advance the action. From the little that we possess of this work, we can hardly speak of its artistic qualities. The whole work gives the impression of a dramatized history book, although in the scenes among the people there are a few faint flashes of Gogol's comic style. Quote, I shall relate in succession how I saw him, the Pope, when my aunt Markinta died. She left me only a half hide of land. Then I said to myself, why should you, Brifric, son of Hivahelm, cultivate the land when you can win glory in combat? After I had told myself that, I traveled by ship to the French king. The earnest conversations of Alfred and the Danish leader with their respective followers are very similar to the bombastic and lifeless rhetoric of the Cossack leaders in Taras Bulba. Count, you are gray of hair, and you give such a piece of advice. No, noble Thanes, everything depends on us now, and on our determination. If we give up, we lose everything, increase the pride of the enemy. I swear we would give them the certainty of their invincibility as well. And who would then be able to do anything against them? Gogol never returned to the fragment. This is easily explained by his growing coolness toward the study of history. However, at this time, Gogol was constantly occupied with the theater. All his plays were sketched out during this period. Among them are two masterworks. Gogol wrote the Inspector General in an astonishingly short period of time. On October 7th, 1835, he asks Pushkin, quote, "Do me a favor and give me some subject, some purely Russian anecdote, comical or not comical. I am burning with the desire to write a comedy," end of quote. It is very likely that Pushkin complied with this request, for years later in, quote, Confessions of the Author, end of quote, Gogol declares that he received the anecdote serving as the basis for the Inspector General from Pushkin. On December 4th, the comedy is already finished, as is evident from a letter to Pagodin. Less than 2 months were needed for one of the greatest comedies of world literature. The anecdote which Pushkin gave him and which is said to have happened to himself is simple. In a remote provincial town, a vain fop who happens to be passing through is mistaken for the incognito Inspector General, whose imminent arrival has been announced. The authorities overwhelm him with servility and displays of respect, and he tolerates it with thoughtless audacity. After his departure, the mistake is revealed. Again? David. This plot corresponded to Gogol's wishes. He was extremely dissatisfied with the usual stereotyped techniques of comedy and rightly considered them outmoded. Always the same situations, always the same love intrigues. From this dead end, the road could lead only to a complete renewal, which would have to be preceded by the elimination of the old stereotypes. His name David Johnston. First of all, the deliberate omission of the love intrigue was decisive. In the 4 scenes of Act 4, it is only parodied. Secondly, the utter lack of any didacticism. And thirdly, connected with this, an absolute refusal to divide the characters into good and bad. Fantastic. Gogol's dismal view of the world, meaninglessness thought to be meaningful, against an ominous background, is also illustrated in this strange comedy. The world is a curious confusion of misunderstandings, but the worst misunderstanding lies in the fact that the overwhelming majority of people believe that they are achieving something positive, something important, that they are something special, and also that they act in all good faith with a certain conviction that they are in the right, and thus only further the hopeless confusion. The forced attempts to stamp the Inspector General as a social satire, a social pamphlet, attempts which, from its first performance to this day, have not subsided, do not get at its true meaning. The work reflects the world, not a Russian provincial town at a certain time. Like the characters, the abuses exist only as symbols. The bribes taken by the mayor, the corruption of the officials, and the hint of an embezzlement are, of course, the only real crimes of which there is mention. But they have no structural function at all. Neither oppression of the innocent, nor interference with justice, nor any other shocking crime worthy of punishment play a role. There can be no question of social sympathy, for the, quote, oppressed, end of quote, here the group of merchants and citizens not holding official positions, are either first-class swindlers themselves, like the merchants, or they are stupid and without dignity, like the non-commissioned officer's widow. And the only one who could possibly arouse our sympathy, the locksmith's wife, considerably dampens the growing positive feelings toward her by her classic cannonade of insults. In the very first scene, it becomes perfectly clear that none of the characters is in his proper place. Yet the fates of other men depend on these men. None of them is really bad, but also none of them is really good. A dreadful, life-killing middle way, a cosmic mediocrity wafts toward the audience. Every individual is extremely satisfied with himself and with the whole. A stagnating confusion. Into this atmosphere explodes Klestakov, the false Inspector General. While the upright, average men of the town are convinced of their importance, Klestakov represents a second dismal possibility for a human type. He is convinced of nothing at all, and of everything, depending on the situation. He is a complete non-entity, a dummy without any center of gravity in himself whatsoever, for whom the border between reality and imagination is easily blurred. He is able to trip along over the waves of confusion which he himself has set in motion precisely because of his empty weightlessness. It was a brilliant move on Gogol's part to represent his hero as completely passive. He is by no means a conscious deceiver or a rogue, just a nothing. And this nothing prospers. This nothing attains glory. Quote, I love good food. After all, one lives in order to pluck the flowers of pleasure. End of quote. This sentence of Klestakov's, both in form and content, characterizes him perfectly. What sort of world is it in which people of this kind live well and end well? The hero's instability is clarified by the structure. In the last scene, his simultaneous betrothal and departure are conclusively motivated but psychologically into independent parallel passages. The fact that the sum of these motivations, united in one person, results in a paradox both brands the character and proves anew the irrationality of existence. The mayor sees himself confronted with an incomprehensible discrepancy. He simultaneously experiences the greatest success and the greatest failure in his life, Klestakov's betrothal and departure. The whole comedy takes place in one day. The events develop with breathtaking speed, and only in this way is the delusion of the officials comprehensible and likely, for in their fear, they leave themselves no time to reflect. One man's senseless fear of another must necessarily lead to disaster. Not the words of conscience are listened to, but the words of the authorities. Dobzhinsky makes the following generalization, quote, "When a high official speaks, one is frightened," end of quote. And the whole play moves in this atmosphere of fear. The plot is embedded, as it were, between a flash of lightning and the thunderclap that one feels approaching inevitably, and that is presented by Gogol in a technically very original manner. In deliberate contrast with Tartuffe, no punishment is imposed on stage. The gendarme merely reports the fact of the arrival of the real Inspector General, and there follows only a sudden shift in the positions of the characters and then a minute-long silence.